Good afternoon. I'm Andrew Hobley, the Principal of the Society of the Faith, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's Liddon Lecture. The Society was founded in 1905 as an association of Anglicans for, among other things, the popularisation of the Catholic faith in the Church of England. You can find more about our ups and our downs and what we do on our website. One of our roles is to look after the Liddon Fund, founded in memory of Revd Canon Professor Harry Liddon. And this annual lecture is one of the activities which the fund provides for. This year we are very pleased to welcome the Revd Dr Michael Ward, Associate Member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Oxford and Professor of Apologetics at Houston Christian University. Known as a literary critic and a theologian, he has a particular interest in the works of G.K. Chesterton, J.R.R. Tolkien, and somebody else who it is very appropriate in the 60th anniversary of the subject's death we'll ask him to speak on, C.S. Lewis. Dr. Ward.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm very glad to be with you. Thank you for the invitation to give this year's Liddon Lecture. Thank you, Marjorie, for all the admin. Thank you, David Lawrence March, I think was the initial suggester of my name for this honour. We've just had a very good lunch at the Solarium, including wine and sticky toffee pudding. So if I fall asleep during my talk, please forgive me. I'm sure you know the old story, the old chestnut of the aged member of the House of Lords who dreamt he was addressing the House of Lords and woke up to discover that he was. Hopefully that won't transpire this afternoon. C.S. Lewis, Anglican Ecumenist, is my title. People have written on and spoken about Lewis the Anglican, Lewis the apologist, Lewis the evangelist, Lewis the novelist, Lewis the classicist, and many other different aspects of his work, but never, to my knowledge, has anyone spoken or written on Lewis the Ecumenist. And there's plenty to say. I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes, I hope, no longer. And I think I can hazard some guesses as to why this topic has not been tackled, and we'll come on to those in a moment. But first of all, let me make a preliminary point, which is to highlight how remarkably acceptable across a broad range of different denominations and churchmanships Lewis is. Whatever he may have said or not said about ecumenism, he's certainly been ecumenically very successful. That his fellow Anglicans have received him well is little surprise, but it is perhaps somewhat surprising that he should have been received favourably, though not, of course, uncritically, by such a range of Anglican figures as, for instance, Rowan Williams, John Sentamu, Alistair McGrath, Tom Wright, Malcolm Guite. They all have either written or spoken very warmly of Lewis and his influence on their faith and their thinking. Outside Anglicanism, Lewis has caught the approving attention of Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, to name but two very prominent Roman Catholics. Here in this country, the Baptist theologian Paul Fides, the late Eastern Orthodox Bishop Callistos Ware have spoken admiringly of Lewis, and in America, the Presbyterian Tim Keller, the notable evangelical leader Philip Ryken, likewise. All these and many others have written and spoken about Lewis at length and very positively, and I could go on, but there's no need to multiply examples. Suffice it to say that Lewis's name is a name to conjure with, both horizontally across the ecclesiological spectrum and vertically up and down the candle, so to speak. Yet Lewis was no ecumenist in the formal sense of the word, which is one of the main reasons why people haven't considered him in this light. Lewis never involved himself in deliberate ecumenical enterprises, like the World Council of Churches, founded in 1948 when he was at the height of his powers. As far as I know, Lewis didn't even sign on to Frank Pakenham, the future Lord Longford's much more local endeavour of a Christian council of all the churches that he founded in Oxford in 1944. Lewis wasn't a man for synods and committees and commissions, and even if he had been such a man, the Mayline conversations of the 1920s happened too early for him, and the Archic process of the late 60s was too late for him to be involved in that, so he missed two of the more notable ecumenical programs of the 20th century. He did, of course, observe the octave of prayer for Christian unity, but that hardly qualifies him as an ecumenist, because any faithful Anglican, any faithful Christian would observe that. So in what sense can we speak of C.S. Lewis, Anglican ecumenist? Well, at this point it might be worth giving a quick biographical sketch of the man. I'm sure you know a fair bit about his life, but let's just quickly remind ourselves so we have a better sense of the man we're dealing with. Clive Staples Lewis was born in 1898 in Belfast. Belfast. That's an important location for an ecumenist to arise from, given that Ulster is one of the most, was then and alas still is now to a certain extent, though by God's grace to a much lesser extent, a very sectarian community. And at the time of Lewis's birth, we're talking about an Ireland that preceded partition of the 1920s. So the so-called Irish problem was very much a live and indeed deadly issue for Lewis and his fellow Irishmen as he grew up. He was raised in a Protestant household. His grandfather was rector of the local church, St Mark's, Dundela, in the outskirts of Belfast. And it was there at that church that Lewis received baptism as an infant and confirmation as a teenager. I know that not all Anglicans like to be characterised as Protestant, but the Lewis family wouldn't have objected, partly because the Catholic-Protestant divide in Ulster was so very strong, and any attempt to, as it were, triangulate would have been seen as a special pleading, and partly because his family was definitely low on the candle. It's accurate to say that the Lewis family wasn't especially or virulently orange, but they were very definitely not in the slightest bit green. They were Protestants, they were loyalists, and the Catholics and the nationalists that surrounded them, that they knew and interacted with, who were agitating for independence, would have been regarded in the Lewis household, I think, as not only mistaken theologically and ecclesiologically, but politically and socially, a danger, a threat to the integrity of that community. So as a boy, growing up in Ulster, Lewis imbibed a certain amount of anti-Catholic prejudice. I think it's fair enough to call it by that name. At least Lewis himself would later use that word. He remembers being told by his nurse when he was a very young boy, when his nurse took him out for a walk on rainy days, "Now mind out there, little Master Jack, and keep your feet out of the puddles. Look at it there, all full of dirty wee popes." So the fact that Lewis would later come to be admired by at least two popes speaks to how well he overcame that early conditioning. He was extracted from that Irish setting at the age of 10, when he was sent away to be educated in the south of England. And it was there, in Surrey, I think it was, that he first became, according to his own later description, an effective believer. Back home in Belfast, he had been taught all the usual things and had accepted them at a fairly superficial level, but now his faith became effective. He says, "As far as I know, the instrument for my newfound faith was the church, to which we were taken twice every Sunday. This was high Anglo-Catholic. On the conscious level," he says, "I reacted strongly against its peculiarities. Was I not an Ulster Protestant? And were not these unfamiliar rituals an essential part of the hated English atmosphere? Unconsciously, I suspect, the candles and incense, the vestments and the hymns sung on our knees may have had a considerable and opposite effect on me. But I do not think they were the important thing. What really mattered was that I here heard the doctrines of Christianity, as distinct from general uplift, taught by men who obviously believed them." So from his very low church, somewhat evangelical upbringing in Belfast, he's now becoming much more open to Anglo-Catholicism. However, although he became an effective believer for a time, he fairly soon, in his early teens, fell away from this youthful faith and thereafter called himself an atheist for about the next 2 decades. Then in his early 30s, he reverted to Christianity, and after that he settled down to a fairly conventional and fairly high church, Anglicanism. He attended his parish, Holy Trinity, Headington Quarry, just outside Oxford, and it's there that he was buried in 1963. He died on the same day that President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. What kind of Anglican was C.S. Lewis? "There is no mystery about my own position," he wrote. "I am a very ordinary layman of the Church of England, not especially high, nor especially low, nor especially anything else." But this is surely very misleading. He may not have considered himself a high churchman in a partisan kind of way, but by any objective reckoning, Lewis was pretty darn high. He used the term Blessed Sacrament. He received Holy Communion every week. He held a high view of the ordained priesthood. He wrote against the ordination of women. He had a deep respect for natural theology. He quoted the Church Fathers. He fasted on Fridays. He went to confession. He entertained serious doubts about the morality of contraception. He believed in purgatory, and he prayed for the dead. Not especially high, nor especially low. No. Lewis, the Anglican Ecumenist, may not have made a song and dance about his own particular brand of churchmanship, but his own beliefs and practices were definitely towards the Catholic or Anglo-Catholic end of the candle, not the evangelical or Reformed end. But though he was on the Catholic-facing frontier of Anglicanism, so to speak, there is no evidence, according to George Sayer, that Lewis ever seriously considered becoming a Catholic himself. George Sayer was a man who knew Lewis for 30 years and more, first as a student at Oxford, then as a friend, and later as one of his biographers. Lewis may have had broad sympathies, but he also had strong convictions, and they included beliefs that certain Roman Catholic doctrines, for instance those about the Blessed Virgin and about the Pope, were mistaken, even heretical. Another little sign of Lewis's own brand of churchmanship is that he subscribed to The Guardian. Not the left-leaning daily newspaper that we now know today, but the weekly Anglican publication that was an offshoot of the Tractarian movement and which ceased operating in 1951. One of Lewis's most popular works, the Screwtape Letters, was serialised in the pages of The Guardian. Screwtape, you remember, is a senior devil writing letters to his nephew Wormwood, a junior tempter, about the best ways to ensnare a human being in sin. Wormwood, the acolyte, having failed to prevent his human patient from becoming a Christian, is advised by his uncle Screwtape to tempt the fledgling believer to indulge partisan spirit and Pharisaism now that he's a Christian. Screwtape proposes a toast to the infernal college of tempters, while swilling in his wine glass what he calls a sound old vintage Pharisee. "You know how this wine is blended?" Screwtape asks. "Different types of Pharisee have been harvested, trodden, and fermented together. Types that were most antagonistic to one another on earth. Some were all rules and relics and rosaries. Others were all drab clothes, long faces, and petty traditional abstinences from wine or cards or the theatre. Both had in common their self-righteousness and the almost infinite distance between their actual outlook and anything the enemy, God, really is or commands. The wickedness of other religions was really the live doctrine in the religion of each. Slander was its gospel, and denigration its litany. It will be an ill day for us if what most humans mean by religion ever vanishes from the earth. It can still send us the truly delicious sins. The fine flower of unholiness can grow only in the close neighbourhood of the holy. Nowhere do we tempt so successfully as on the very steps of the altar." So, to assist Wormwood's patient in becoming a Pharisee, Screwtape would have him think of Christian doctrines only insofar as they provide opportunities for exacerbating parti pris. Screwtape again, "The real fun is working up hatred between those who say Mass, or even Mass, and those who say Holy Communion, when neither party could possibly state the difference between, say, Richard Hooker's doctrine and Thomas Aquinas's in any form which would hold water for 5 minutes." Having been born and raised in one of the most sectarian Christian environments in the world, Ulster, Lewis was well placed to observe the petty-mindedness and ignorance of many ecclesiastical disputes, which his satire in the Screwtape Letters skewers with such bracing precision. Another reason for Lewis's healthy cynicism about ecclesiastical disputes arose from his own professional expertise as a literary historian. The biggest book Lewis ever wrote was entitled English Literature in the 16th Century Excluding Drama. Snappy title if ever there was one. It was part of a multi-volume series of books by different scholars, and the whole series was called the Oxford History of English Literature. Oh hell, as Lewis abbreviated it. And in his 700-page tome, his Oh hell volume, as he called it, Lewis describes the history of the English Reformation as a tragic farce. He says this: "The theological questions really at issue have no significance except on a certain level, a high level of the spiritual life. They could have been fruitfully debated only between mature and saintly disputants in close privacy and at boundless leisure. In fact, however, these questions were raised at a moment when they immediately became embittered and entangled with a whole complex of matters theologically irrelevant, and therefore attracted the fatal attention both of the government and of the mob. When once this had happened, Europe's chance to come through unscathed was lost. Each party increasingly misunderstood the other and triumphed in refuting positions which their opponents did not hold. Protestants misrepresenting Romans as Pelagians, or Romans misrepresenting Protestants as antinomians." He goes on to admit in the pages of his Oh Hell book that it will not be easy to discuss the English Reformation without giving offence. "I ask my readers to believe that I have at least intended to be impartial. Unfortunately, the very names we have to use in describing this controversy are themselves controversial. To call the one party Catholics implicitly grants their claim. To call them Roman Catholics implicitly denies it. I shall therefore call them papists. The word, I believe, is not now used dislogistically, except in Ulster. And it's certainly not so intended here. So both from his Ulster upbringing and his study of the 16th century, Lewis had reason to cast a very jaundiced eye over ecclesiastical and intra-ecclesiological disputes. He saw how easily and how unnecessarily theological questions could become proxies or stalking horses or smoke screens for other much more worldly matters that excited the interest of the government and the mob. To his Belfast origin and his scholarly expertise, we can add a third colour in our gradually accumulating portrait, and that is Lewis's own personal temperament, his own psychology. Lewis was an individualist. He was something of a lone ranger. And he admits this in his autobiography. He talks about his own individualism, his own lawlessness even. Before his adult return to the faith, Lewis was, by his own admission, deeply anti-ecclesiastical. I had as little wish to be in the church as in a zoo. The church was, to begin with, a kind of collective, a wearisome get-together affair. I couldn't yet see how a concern of that sort should have anything to do with one's spiritual life. To me, religion ought to have been a matter of good men praying alone and meeting by twos and threes to talk of spiritual matters. And then the fussy, time-wasting botheration of it all, the bells, the crowds, the umbrellas, the notices, the bustle, the perpetual arranging and organising. Hymns were and are extremely disagreeable to me. Of all musical instruments, I liked and like the organ least. I have, too, a sort of spiritual gaucherie which makes me unapt to participate in any rite. Now, some of those attitudes he did overcome after his reversion to the faith in his early 30s, but some remained, and the general tone and shape of his character certainly remained. Not only was Lewis no partisan, he was also quite a private man. He was never animated or energized by the idea of corporate activity. He accepted, of course, the fact that the Christian life involved membership in a larger body, a spiritual body, but he didn't make a big thing about recognizing or celebrating the instantiation of that spiritual body of Christ at a social or a public or a corporate visible level. Lewis wasn't one for either the small talk or the bureaucracy that enables corporate bodies to function effectively. He was very much a cat who walked alone, and he wasn't at all bothered by that solitude. And he didn't care to encourage others even to imitate him. "We few, we happy few," was a line from Shakespeare that he resonated with. So when, in 1933, after he had returned to the faith and he wrote an allegorical account of that conversion entitled A Pilgrim's Regress, he deliberately made it somewhat vague in terms of churchmanship. He said that he intended the book to be a general apologetic allegory for all who profess and call themselves Christians. And the allegory, he said, was concerned with Christianity as against unbelief. Denominational questions do not come in, he said. And this takes us, naturally enough, to what is probably Lewis's best known and most influential work of non-fiction, at any rate, namely Mere Christianity, which is as non-denominational as can possibly be imagined. Mere Christianity, as I'm sure you know, collects together in one volume 3 shorter books by Lewis, which were originally 4 series of radio broadcasts given over the BBC during the Second World War. And in the preface of the collected volume, Mere Christianity, he zeroes in on the title, saying this: "Ever since I became a Christian, I have thought that the best, perhaps the only service I could do for my unbelieving neighbours was to explain and defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times. I had more than one reason for thinking this. In the first place, the questions which divide Christians from one another often involve points of high theology or even of ecclesiastical history, which ought never to be treated except by real experts. Secondly, I think we must admit that the discussion of these disputed points has no tendency at all to bring an outsider into the Christian fold. Finally, I got the impression that far more and more talented authors were already engaged in such controversial matters than in the defence of what Baxter calls mere Christianity. That part of the line where I thought I could serve best was also the part that seemed to me to be thinnest, and to it I naturally went. The Baxter he's referring to there is Richard Baxter, 1615 to 1691, an English preacher and prolific writer who sided with Oliver Cromwell during the English Civil War and the Puritan Commonwealth, who was an inveterate peacemaker and even helped, surprisingly, with the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. Baxter was subsequently barred from ecclesiastical office and was even imprisoned for a period, for 18 months, I understand. In a work written in the last decade of his life, Baxter wrote this: "I am a Christian, a mere Christian, of no other religion. And the church that I am of is the Christian church, and hath been visible wherever the Christian religion and church hath been visible. But must you know what sect or party I am of? I am against all sects and dividing parties. But if any will call mere Christians by the name of a party, because they take up with mere Christianity, creed and scripture, and will not be of any dividing or contentious sect, I am of that party which is so against parties." And it's very much in that spirit of Richard Baxter that Lewis, in his preface to Mere Christianity, says this: "The reader should be warned that I offer no help to anyone who is hesitating between two Christian denominations. You will not learn from me whether you ought to become an Anglican, a Methodist, a Presbyterian, or a Roman Catholic. This omission is intentional. Even in the list I have just given, the order is alphabetical. There's no mystery about my own position," and here he gives that somewhat disingenuous description of himself that we've already talked about. "I am a very ordinary layman of the Church of England, not especially high, nor especially low, nor especially anything else. But in this book, I am not trying to convert anyone to my own position." He goes on to explain that the second section of the book, where he talks about the incarnation and the atonement, he has had vetted by clergymen of 4 different traditions: Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, Roman Catholic, asking for their criticism. "Let us at least be ecumenical," he said to the man at the BBC who oversaw his talks when he was preparing them for publication. And this, I think, "let us at least be ecumenical," is the only time Lewis uses that word ecumenical when referring to any one of his works. He goes on and says, "The Methodist," talking about those who have vetted what he wrote, "the Methodist thought I had not said enough about faith, and the Roman Catholic thought I had gone rather too far about the comparative unimportance of theories in explanation of the atonement. Otherwise, all 5 of us were agreed. I did not have the remaining sections of the book similarly vetted, because in them, though differences might arise among Christians, these would be differences between individuals or schools of thought, not between denominations." And later in the preface he remarks, "So far as I can judge from reviews and from the numerous letters written to me, this book, Mere Christianity, however faulty in other respects, did at least succeed in presenting an agreed or common or central or mere Christianity. In that way, it may possibly be of some help in silencing the view that if we omit the disputed points, we shall have left only a vague and bloodless highest common factor. The HCF turns out to be something not only positive, but pungent, divided from all non-Christian beliefs by a chasm to which the worst divisions inside Christendom are not really comparable at all. If I've not directly helped the cause of reunion, I have perhaps made it clear why we ought to be reunited. Certainly, I have met with little of the fabled odium theologicum from convinced members of communions different from my own. Hostility has come more from borderline people, whether within the Church of England or without. Men not exactly obedient to any communion. This I find curiously consoling. It is at her centre, where her truest children dwell, that each communion is really closest to every other, in spirit, if not in doctrine. And this suggests that at the centre of each there is a something or a someone who, against all divergences of belief, all differences of temperament, all memories of mutual persecution, speaks with the same voice. And he concludes the preface very ironically with the following two paragraphs, which are worth quoting. I hope no reader will suppose that mere Christianity is here put forward as an alternative to the creeds of the existing communions, as if a man could adopt it in preference to Congregationalism or Greek Orthodoxy or anything else. Mere Christianity is more like a hall out of which doors open onto several different rooms. If I can bring anyone into that hall, I shall have done what I attempted. But it is in the rooms, not in the hall, that there are fires and chairs and meals. The hall is a place to wait in, a place from which to try the various doors, not a place to live in. For that purpose, the worst of the rooms, whichever that may be, is, I think, preferable to the hall. When you have reached your own room, be kind to those who have chosen different doors and to those who are still in the hall. If they are wrong, they need your prayers all the more, and if they are your enemies, then you are under orders to pray for them. That is one of the rules common to the whole house. With this metaphor of the house with its different rooms, Lewis is doing something that qualifies him very much, I think, as an ecumenist, not least because at the root of the word ecumenism is the Greek oike, meaning household, a place where one lives. But notice how Lewis achieves his effect. He does it by ignoring out of existence those things that separate different Christian traditions, or rather by relativizing them, by capturing them in his own household image. He's not ushering people out from their existing particular denominational houses into a brand new house, a house labelled reunion. He's instead asserting that different Christians already live in the same house. They're already united. They already live at a single address, just in different rooms of it. It's an intriguing and clever rhetorical move, and one that has proved to be remarkably effective, ecumenically speaking. Admittedly, not so much at the institutional level, but certainly at the individual level. All sorts of people have been brought into the hall and have learnt to look upon those in different rooms much more positively as a result of reading this book. It's at the individual level that Lewis is principally aiming, and that particularly mattered to him himself. Lewis is, as it were, a spokesman for the common man and to the common man. He wasn't ordained. He wasn't even officially trained in theology. He never studied theology formally. He never taught theology. But he did see it as his vocation to preach mere Christianity, not ad clarem, but ad populum. He says, any success that has been given to me has, I believe, been due to my strict observance of those limits. By attempting to do otherwise, I should only add one more recruit, and a very ill-qualified recruit, to the ranks of the controversialists. After that, I should be no more use to anyone. John Paul II once said to Walter Hooper had been Lewis's secretary in the last months of Lewis's life and later became Lewis's editor and biographer. Hooper had an audience with John Paul II. John Paul said, "Lewis knew his apostolate, and he did it." He was determined to avoid controversial, institutional, interdenominational matters. And it was very hard to get Lewis to talk about those things, even in private correspondence. In a letter to his friend Alan Griffiths, who had become a Benedictine monk, Lewis wrote, "I had better say once and for all that I do not intend to discuss with you in future, if I can help it, any of the questions at issue between our respective churches. I do not think there is anything distressing for either of us in agreeing to be silent on this matter. When all is said, and truly said, about the divisions of Christendom, there remains by God's mercy an enormous common ground. It is abstaining from one tree in the whole garden." One tree in the garden. That allusion to the tree in the Garden of Eden would make it appear that Lewis regarded discussion of divisive issues to be a kind of sin, a fretful picking at a scab or a reopening of a wound. And indeed, elsewhere he said that disputations do more to aggravate schism than to heal it. He operated on the principle of least said, soonest mended. Just occasionally, very occasionally, he would acknowledge some of the basic questions at issue. So in an article intended for a Catholic publication, we don't know which publication, and we don't even know if it actually appeared in this publication, but it was definitely written for a Roman Catholic publication, an article entitled Christian Reunion. Lewis, having referred to our tragic and sinful divisions, goes on to say that the real difficulty is our disagreement about the seat and nature of doctrinal authority. And then he says, on this disagreement, almost all the other disagreements depend. But Lewis never, either in that article or elsewhere, gave an account of religious authority as he understood it. He does take the Vincentian canon, it seems, as his authority, what has been believed by everyone, everywhere, and every time. He does seem to take that as his authority. That's basically the grounds for his mere Christianity. But he doesn't explain why he does so or how he gets to that conclusion. The authority behind his ecumenism is, in other words, assumed and not defended. But making that assumption gets him a very long way. He didn't feel the need to show his working, and very few people have asked him to show his working. In another letter to Griffiths, Lewis said, "One of the most important differences between us, between me, the Anglican, and you, the Roman Catholic, is our estimate of the importance of the differences. You," he says to Griffiths, "in your charity are anxious to convert me, but I am not in the least anxious to convert you." Lewis simply didn't think there was anything, or at least not much, to be gained by achieving institutional unity if the deeper unity of charity was lacking. First things first, in other words. And so in a late letter to the Jesuit priest Father Peter Millward, Lewis wrote this: "Our Lord prayed that we all might be one, as he and his Father are one. But he and his Father are not one in virtue of both accepting a third monarchical sovereign." Our Lord and his Father are not one in virtue of both accepting a third monarchical sovereign. And then he goes on and says, that unity of rule or even of credenda does not necessarily produce unity of charity is apparent from the history of every church, every religious order, and every parish. Schism, however you want to say it, is a very great evil. But if reunion is ever to come, it will, in my opinion, come from increasing charity. A single act of cooperation does more towards ultimate reunion than any amount of discussion. So if I were to summarize Lewis's ecumenical approach in a single phrase, I think I would say that his was an ecumenism of charity. Let me draw to a close by examining two examples of where Lewis practiced what he preached, exercising charity to those of a different communion, cooperating with them where appropriate, even while not moving towards them institutionally. The first example is his friendship with J.R.R. Tolkien. In his autobiography, Lewis wrote that, "At my first coming into the world, I had been implicitly warned never to trust a papist. And at my first coming into the English faculty at Oxford, explicitly warned never to trust a philologist. Tolkien was both." And in that way, he said, friendship with Tolkien marked the breakdown of two old prejudices. Lewis's first encounter with Tolkien occurred in 1926 at a meeting of the English faculty at Oxford. Lewis, this anti-papistical Ulsterman, recorded the event in his diary, saying of Tolkien, "He's a smooth, pale, fluent little chap. No harm in him, only needs a smack or so." That was 1926. 3 years later, their friendship really took root when Tolkien took the fairly bold step of sharing with Lewis a poem that he had been writing, exposing his own imaginative creativity for the criticism of Lewis. And it became a friendship that was transformative for both men. Indeed, if they had never met, it's entirely possible that we would know nothing of either of them today. If Tolkien had not become friends with Lewis, very probably his great work, The Lord of the Rings, would never have been finished, let alone published. Tolkien himself admitted that, but for Lewis's interest and unceasing eagerness for more, I should never have brought The Lord of the Rings to a conclusion. Conversely, without Tolkien, Lewis quite possibly wouldn't have become a Christian, or at least not during that pivotal stage of his life in his early 30s, with his literary career ahead of him. And thus we might not have had Mere Christianity or the Screwtape Letters or so many other works. As Lewis recalled years later, Tolkien gave me much help in getting over the last stile of his conversion. Tolkien, though a devout Roman Catholic, found friendship with the Anglican Lewis to be an edifying experience. Whether they were sharing a drink in the Eagle and Child pub or reading aloud to each other their works in progress. Indeed, so spiritually helpful did Tolkien find these interactions that he became alert to the surprising number of obstacles that seemed to arise when they were planned. Jokingly, Tolkien surmised that a minor imp of Slubgob's brood specially attends to preventing CSL and myself from meeting. Slubgob, as I'm sure you recall, is one of Screwtape's colleagues. After Lewis's conversion, or perhaps we should say reversion to Christian faith, he, in fairly short order, acquired a significant public profile, first with his broadcast talks on the BBC, and then with the success of Screwtape. In 1944, an article in the Daily Telegraph drew attention to his growing reputation. The article read, "Ascetic Mr. C.S. Lewis is becoming ever more of a power in Oxford. Though a layman, he often occupies one or other of the pulpits in the university. He more than fills the University Church of St. Mary's. There is much speculation about his future. Many think that his deep spiritual powers may put him at the head of a new Oxford movement." Tolkien saw this article and wrote about it to his son, saying that Lewis had received the doubtful honour of a peculiarly misrepresentative and asinine paragraph in the Daily Telegraph. It began, "Ascetic Mr. Lewis. I ask you." He put away 3 pints in a very short session this morning and said he was going short for Lent. As for his heading a new Oxford movement, Well, yes, if we keep in mind that it was not a specifically Anglican movement that he found himself involved in, but an ecumenical and indeed evangelizing movement. What Lewis was principally interested in was a baptizing of the imagination and a Christianizing of England as a whole, not so much a Catholicizing of the Church of England, even though he was pretty Anglo-Catholic, as we have seen. Again, I am not trying to convert anyone to my own position. So that's his friendship with Tolkien. Now let me close with a second example of Lewis exercising fraternal charity with someone from a different communion. And this comes from his long correspondence, they never met in person, with an Italian priest called Giovanni Calabria, a correspondence that they conducted entirely in Latin. And a correspondence which, by the way, largely concerned Christian unity. Giovanni Calabria was the founder of the Congregation of the Poor Servants of Divine Providence. He was born in Verona in 1873. He died in 1954, and he was canonized by Pope John Paul II in 1999. Calabria had made it part of his mission to enter into correspondence with members of other churches, and his addressees included the Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Fisher, and representatives of the Orthodox and Lutheran communions. In 1947, Calabria wrote to Lewis saying, "I candidly confess to you that from the first years of my priesthood I have turned my mind with all my strength to this great problem." He's meaning what he calls the sigh of the most sacred heart of Jesus, manifested in that prayer of his to the Father before he suffered, that they all may be one. Calabria goes on, "To the same end, I have humbly taken the trouble as opportunity offers to send letters here and there. I promise to pray strenuously that God will see fit to strengthen you, that you may be able to perform something of great moment in the Lord's vineyard, so that at last it may be seen that there is one fold and one shepherd." And in Lewis's first reply to Calabria, he says, "Be assured that for me too, schism in the body of Christ is both a source of grief and a matter for prayers, being a most serious stumbling block to those coming in, and one which makes even the faithful weaker in repelling the common foe. However, I am a layman, indeed the most lay of laymen, and least skilled in the deeper questions of sacred theology. I have tried to do the only thing that I think myself able to do, that is, to leave completely aside the subtler questions about which the Roman Church and Protestants disagree among themselves, things which are to be treated of by bishops and learned men, and in my own books to expound rather those things which still, by God's grace, after so many sins and errors, are shared by us. Nor is this a pointless task, for I find that people are unaware how many matters we even now agree on. So much so that I have come across someone who believed that you Catholics, you Romans, deny the three-in-one God. Over and above that work, it has always seemed to me that I should maintain as much fraternal intercourse as possible with all those who call themselves Christians. If all were actively to do this, might we not hope that this unity of love and action over many years would precede, not to say foster, an eventual reunification of doctrines? Thirdly, there remain what is most efficacious, prayers." Elsewhere, he writes to Calabria, and with this I will close, "Common perils, common burdens, can, by God's grace, contribute much to the healing of our divisions. For those who suffer the same things from the same people for the same person can scarcely not love each other. Indeed, I could well believe that it is God's intention, since we have refused milder remedies, to compel us into unity by persecution even and hardship. That they all may be one is a petition which in my prayers I never omit." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael. There is a little connection, funnily enough, with Faith House and Lewis. One of our tenants is the National Churches Trust, and this year they gave £25,000 to St Mark's, Dundela.
Right.
Where, as you said, Lewis was baptised, and where he and his brother dedicated a window, commissioned a window for their parents.
Mm-hmm.
So in fact there is actually a connection between our subject and this very building and one of its tenants. So yes, thank you. Does anybody have any questions to ask?
Could I start the ball rolling?
You may.
Could you, Michael, say something about Lewis's relationship with Dorothy L. Sayers? I've read in Barbara Reynolds's biography of her that there was certainly correspondence between the two of them, including an exchange of letters about the ordination of women. They had much in common. They were both Oxford, they both broadcasted. What was the relationship between them, if any?
Yes, they did correspond quite a bit. They met on a small number of occasions, I believe, because of course Dorothy lived in London and Essex, but not in her adult life. She was a student. She was born in Oxford and she was educated at Somerville College, Oxford, but she then moved to London and Essex, and so they only rarely met. But Lewis knew some of her works. He speaks very highly of Dorothy Sayers' The Mind of the Maker. He wrote a panegyric for her funeral. He wasn't able to attend her funeral, but he sent this message in which he said he enjoyed her personality as one enjoys a high gale. She was very bracing. And you can see that coming. I mean, of course, I never met her, but you can see what he meant just by reading many of her own letters and some of her other works. And she admired his work. Yes, Lewis wrote to her at one point and said in the late 1940s that she ought to say something about the ordination of women. It would be better coming from a woman, he said, than from him. But Dorothy Sayers declined to get involved in that. I don't know her own particular views on that matter, but she didn't want to. She didn't have a dog in that fight, or at least not one that she wanted to expose publicly. So Lewis, as a result, wrote his own piece on that subject. I'm not quite sure that I can say much to questions of ecumenism between the two of them.
She was very much a sort of committed churchgoer,
yes,
church warden, and
yes,
so which, of course, he didn't play that sort of part.
No, but they were very much of I think the same kind of churchmanship.
Yeah.
And so I think they saw themselves, along with Charles Williams, as forming a sort of united front, as it were, trying to maintain a Catholic view of Anglicanism in England during the Second World War. But some people think that Dorothy Sayers was one of the Inklings, but she wasn't. She never attended any of those meetings. It was a male-only group. But she certainly had very strong friendships with Charles Williams and C.S. Lewis. Yeah.
Thank you.
You gave a list at the start of assorted Christians from various denominations who have been very approving of Lewis. But I was wondering, is there much evidence that his writings brought many people in from outside? Inside the tent looking out, Lewis is great, but if you're outside the tent, is there any evidence that I'm sure he did, but is there much evidence that he brought people in? I remember when I first started going to church, I think I probably acquired all the Lewis books and read them. They've now drifted off somewhere, and they must have had some influence, hopefully positive, on me. But by that time I was already inside, looking out. But is there any evidence?
Yes, there's a lot of evidence, and especially in connection with the book Mere Christianity. I think it was in the year 2000 that the American Christianity Today journal did a survey amongst its readers of those books which, aside from the Bible, had been most instrumental in their own path to faith. They asked readers to write and name that title which had helped them most, and Mere Christianity was named more often than any other book by a large margin. more than twice as many times as its nearest rival. That's America. In Britain too, I think there's plenty of evidence that Mere Christianity has been very influential. I mean, my own father actually would largely attribute his own conversion to reading Mere Christianity, and I know many others similarly. There was a book brought out about 15 years ago entitled Mere Christians, and it contained 40 or 50 little accounts from people who basically said, I became a Christian because of either C.S. Lewis in general or Mere Christianity in particular. So yes, many, many examples.
Thank you.
I'm going to have some difficulty expressing this question, I'm afraid, but I want to suggest that Lewis essentially misunderstands ecumenism because of his view that there is somehow the tree, as you described, or the inner hall, where you can find all the essential Christian beliefs that everyone agrees on, and that what separates people is subsidiary. I think that's just as wrong as his attitude towards the Reformation was wrong, and it would be interesting to know what contemporary Reformation historians think of that chapter in the Oxford, because it is, when you get down to it, it is how we understand creation and the effects of the fall, how we read the Bible, how we understand atonement, what we mean by incarnation and its relationship to sacramentality, which are essential, which are very different in the different churches, and you can't, as it were, I think it's naive to think that somehow there's an essential element of faith which we can all agree on, because that ignores the fact that the things that divide us are all related to a different understanding of those essential beliefs. And therefore, Lewis's church was the church of C.S. Lewis, and I'm reminded of the fact that Tolkien, who didn't always find his friendship, which was deep with Lewis, easy, certainly in the early days, and the fact that he said of Lewis that somehow he never lost that Ulster Protestantism in his general approach. Sorry, I've gone on too long, but the essential point is whether or not he really understood ecumenism in that sense. Yes,
well, this may be another reason why he hasn't been treated much as an ecumenist, because he is insofar as he can plausibly be called an ecumenist, and I think he can under certain rubrics. His approach to ecclesiology was very undeveloped. I mean, even when you try to just zero in on his own Anglican self-understanding, it was not a developed ecclesiology, at least not that you can trace through extant records. I mean, of course, you mustn't confuse letters and diaries and historical data with exactly what Lewis, because we don't know that. But insofar as we can reconstruct it, Lewis seems to have had very little interest in ecclesiology. There was a book brought out, a book of essays 10 years ago, something like that, called C.S. Lewis and the Church, Essays in Honour of Walter Hooper, on his 80th birthday, from a variety of different contributors, some Anglican, some evangelical, American evangelical, some Roman Catholic. And there was a very intriguing piece. I think the most thought-provoking piece in the book was by an American Roman Catholic called James Como. And his piece was called Lewis's Quantum Church. You can't quite pin it down. Is it here, is it there? These Frenchies seek him everywhere. It's a very loose construct. And some people have complained that this speaks to Lewis's sort of not wholly suppressed Manichaeism, a sort of elevation of the spiritual as over against the material. I think that's possibly a bit harsh, But I certainly sympathise with what I take to be the basic thrust of your question, that when you really press in a thoroughgoing fashion to mere Christianity, it doesn't hold up terribly well. But then I'm not sure that how determinedly Lewis would try to defend it theologically. I think he saw it as a useful legal fiction to a certain extent, a way of thinking, as it were. And I mean, he was, logical enough to know that what he claims to be the broad mainstream, which all Christians have, in all places, at all times, have believed, once you begin to, really subject that to a critique, you say, well, what about Athanasius? Athanasius contra mundum. He was one against the majority, but he was in the right. So you can't really prove anything from sheer numbers. And he would have recognized that. And so he doesn't say that, in that bit I quoted from Mere Christianity, he doesn't say that which all Christians have believed. Nearly all. He's covering his back with that well-chosen word, nearly, just to protect himself against precisely that critique, I think. But for all that it's, maybe a sleight of hand, done with smoke and mirrors, it has been, as I've just been explaining, a hugely successful. It's a bit of a conjuring trick, but one which has been done with very good intent and with very good effect. So maybe that's okay. Yes, sir.
A longer-lived contemporary of C.S. Lewis was Geoffrey Fisher, who was very much in the ecumenical field. And when you say that Lewis was at the height of his powers after the Second World War, you see that Geoffrey Fisher was stomping around the continent, and there are plaques to him in places like Geneva. What was the relationship between Lewis and the Archbishop, if any?
There was a relationship. Fisher invited Lewis to join the commission to revise the Psalter as a literary man rather than as a theologian. Lewis, along with T.S. Eliot, were brought in to give advice as to the poetry of the new Psalter. So Fisher wrote to Lewis inviting him, and Lewis, as I said, Lewis was not one for committees and commissions. He generally tried to avoid them. But on this occasion he said, if you really think there's no one better available, I will regard it as a point of duty and I will submit. And so he went faithfully to these meetings in London for that task. I don't know that he had much by the way of actual personal interactions with Fisher outside that committee. I'm not even sure that Fisher himself was on the committee, was he? I can't remember. There's a very interesting article on that very subject in this book, C.S. Lewis and the Church, that I mentioned, by Francis Warner. But yes, you're quite right. Fisher was very notably ecumenically minded, wasn't he? He went to the Vatican for the first time of any Archbishop of Canterbury since 1397. So I discovered as I was preparing this talk. And I think it's worth bearing in mind how much, particularly Anglican Roman dialogue and relations improved in the course of the 20th century. I've just been reading a very fine book called Tolkien's Faith, a Spiritual Biography by Holly Ordway. It's just come out to mark the 50th anniversary of Tolkien's death last month. And Ordway gives a very thorough historical sketch of the conditions that Tolkien met when his mother became a Roman Catholic when he was 8 years old. And it gives a timeline of all the various different changes that unfolded in the course of the 20th century, including, basic things like the United Kingdom didn't have diplomatic relations with the Holy See at the time of Tolkien's birth, and in fact not full ambassadorial relations even until the 1980s, I think. Is that right? And that's sort of mind-boggling to us now. But it just speaks to these sorts of tensions and difficulties that that Lewis and indeed Tolkien in different ways are up against in their various attempts to be ecumenically minded. A lot of the pressures socially and historically were towards apartheid on this question.
Michael, do you think Lewis's reticence to talk about ecumenism was pastoral, theological, or psychological? What I mean by that was, did he think that this was the best way of getting people into the hallway of the house? Did he think it was entirely to do with the fact of his own disqualification from speaking about deep theology from before the dawn of time, about ecclesiology? Or was it, one can look at Lewis's biography and see that there are plenty of places where he just doesn't like to talk about stuff. Thinking about Warney's health or about even Mrs. Moore.
Yes. You probably know the crack from one of the members of the Inklings after Surprised by Joy came out, and it skirted over all sorts of really important things in Lewis's life. And one of the Inklings said it shouldn't have been called Surprised by Joy, it should have been called Suppressed by Jack. Yes, he was very capable of squelching topics he didn't want to pursue. Very very capable of compartmentalizing himself. And there are many reasons. I've touched on some of them. You interestingly used the word psychological, or the psychological reasons, and I think that's quite an interesting vein to mine. I think there can be something of a psychological assumption that you cure things by addressing them. And it's slightly counterintuitive to think that the best way to cure them might be not addressing them. And of course, there are dangers in not addressing questions, that they just fester and go down even deeper because people think they can't talk about them. So that's a definite danger. But there's also, just what's the best way of letting a cut heal? Is it by lifting the bandage up and looking at it every day, or is it just forget about it, let it heal? And to a certain extent, I think that least said, soonest mended approach was, from a psychological point of view, Lewis's rationale for his approach. You're quite right to say also that he did have quite a low view of his own theological expertise. He knew he wasn't theologically trained, and he was very cautious about opining too pontifically on subjects outside his own field. So that's another reason for limiting himself to the broad mainstream as he understood it. I think also another thing that's worth saying about Mere Christianity is that when you look at it in comparison with, say, other similar books, other introductory works like Tom Wright's Simply Christian, or John Stott's Basic Christianity, or Tim Keller, that Presbyterian I mentioned, he's got a book called The Matter of God or something, I can't remember the reason for God. Lewis's book is just much more readable. I think it's worth pointing out that Lewis was a poet. Lewis understood symbol and metaphor and analogy in ways which most Christian communicators don't. And that's one of the reasons why his book is so effective, that even though he's not ordained, even though he's not theologically trained, he does have a great capacity as a rhetorician. He's got keen psychological insights, which come partly from his own atheistical period, when he looked very skeptically at Christian claims. And he realized that a lot of Christian apology just assumes that your interlocutor understands that the Bible says this, the tradition says this. Well, those aren't the authorities that Lewis typically relies on. He's much more concerned with logic, philosophy, history, things which aren't so obviously theological or religious, but which can get you a long way in theology and religion, if only you will follow them in the right direction. So I think that's one of the great successes behind Mere Christianity, just from the point of view of communication theory, that he's saying a lot of things that priests and pastors and theologians and Christians generally would want to say, but just not in an obviously Christian fashion. That's the masterstroke behind so much of it. Thank you.
Thank you. One more question?
Thank you. I think you may have just answered this question, but you say that Mere Christianity was originally a series of talks on the radio.
Yeah.
Was it a surprise that the BBC chose him? Why did they choose him rather than some ordained person to talk about Christianity?
Yes, well, the chap at the BBC had read The Problem of Pain, which had come out in 1940, and had been impressed by that. And perhaps he also knew of The Pilgrim's Regress, which had come out in 1933. Anyway, that was sufficient for the invitation to be made to Lewis. And he was only asked in the first instance to give, I think, 4 talks, 4 15-minute talks on Christianity in 1941, I think. So it wasn't much of a wager, it wasn't much of a risk on the part of the BBC. They were trying him out, as it were. They were trialling him. And because those first 4 talks went down so very well, and he was absolutely inundated with mail, both of the most adulatory and the most critical kind, that the BBC said, oh, well, we might have got a broadcaster on our hands. And so they invited him to do a second series, and then a third series, and then a fourth series. It just grew like Topsy. There was no master plan ahead of time to produce a book that would be called Mere Christianity. And in fact, what we now know as Mere Christianity isn't even precisely those talks. It's based on the 3 books that came out, 3 little books that came out containing most of the talks and little additions. And then there are further additions for the final volume. So it grew very organically and rather haphazardly. And the very term Mere Christianity does not appear in any of the earlier iterations. It's a sort of umbrella term that Lewis just sort of slaps on this varied body of material after the fact. He had already been interested in the concept of mere Christianity for a long time, so it wasn't a completely irrelevant umbrella term laid over all these other materials. But when you look at Mere Christianity from the point of view of literary criticism and ask, what is this book really about? It's very various. It's a very unusual kind of book. Rather like Lewis, is a very unusual ecumenist. He's just a very peculiar person. I don't mean funny peculiar. I just mean odd. There are not many people working in the same vein as him, which again may speak to his success, that he's filling a gap, that part of the line which seemed to him to be thinnest, he went to, and he was just the right shape for the gap in the hedge. He was, cometh the hour, cometh the man, sort of thing. I can't now remember your question, but...
I think that answers it.
But, yeah, remarkable man, but very, very peculiar.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I think we must leave it there. I'd like to thank a couple of people. I'd like to thank Marjorie Roberts, Society's Secretary and Treasurer, for her efficient organisation of this event. I'd like to thank Aaron and Chris, who are responsible for the filming. And particularly, I would like to thank Michael for his very interesting and I think thought-provoking discussion of a very peculiar man. I'm referring, of course, to C.S. Lewis, not to our distinguished lecturer. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.